There's a place on Earth larger than Europe, a place where temperatures can fall below -80 degrees Celsius, where winds sometimes reach more than 300 kilometers per hour, and where almost no permanent human civilization has ever existed. That place is Antarctica. Most people think of it as just a frozen desert at the bottom of the world, endless ice, howling winds, and a handful of research stations scattered across the landscape. But the deeper you look into Antarctica's history, the stranger it becomes. Despite being one of the most scientifically studied places on Earth, it is also one of the most restricted. You can travel almost anywhere else on the planet. You can hike through remote mountain ranges. You can explore deep jungles, deserts, and isolated islands. But Antarctica? Large portions of it remain completely inaccessible to the public. You can't simply organize an expedition and wander deep into the continent. You can't freely dig into the ice or conduct private exploration. And that raises a question that most people never stop to ask. Why? The official explanation is straightforward. Antarctica is protected by international agreements to preserve its fragile ecosystem and maintain it as a place for peaceful scientific research. But when you start looking into the early exploration of the continent, something interesting begins to appear. Certain discoveries were never fully explained. Certain reports from early expeditions were heavily edited before publication, and certain areas became quietly restricted long before modern environmental rules existed. It's almost as if Antarctica revealed something unexpected, something that made governments decide that the safest course of action was to limit access and keep the focus strictly on science. To understand why, we have to go back to the 19th century, a time when Antarctica was still one of the greatest mysteries on Earth. In the early 1800s, Antarctica was little more than a rumor. Cartographers had long suspected that there must be a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance the continents of the north, but no one had confirmed its existence. Sailors occasionally reported glimpses of icy coastlines far to the south, but the region was incredibly dangerous to navigate. Massive icebergs, unpredictable storms, and freezing temperatures made exploration extremely difficult. Still, the possibility of discovering a new continent was too tempting to ignore. So during the late 1830s and early 1840s, several major expeditions set out to explore the far south. 3 of the most famous were led by Charles Wilkes of the United States, Jules Dumont d'Urville of France, and James Clark Ross of Britain. Within just a few years, all 3 expeditions reached the icy coastline of Antarctica. Together, they charted thousands of miles of previously unknown shoreline. For the scientific world, these voyages were monumental achievements. Maps were created, new species were documented, and the existence of the Antarctic continent was finally confirmed. But when historians began studying the journals and logs from these expeditions decades later, they noticed something curious. Scattered throughout the private accounts of sailors and officers were descriptions of rock formations that seemed unusual. In some places, the wind had blown snow away from exposed cliffs, revealing sections of bare stone beneath the ice. Several explorers described these formations as strangely regular. They mentioned flat surfaces, sharp angles, and repeating shapes. One sailor wrote about a cliff face that appeared almost layered in steps, as if the rock had been cut or shaped. Another described formations that resembled enormous stone blocks. Of course, nature can create surprisingly geometric patterns. Volcanic activity can produce column-shaped rock structures. Freezing and thawing can split stone into angular fragments. But what caught the attention of later researchers wasn't just the shapes themselves. It was the fact that multiple crews, traveling hundreds of miles apart, described similar formations. And in many cases, these observations were absent from the official reports published after the expeditions returned home. The official scientific summaries focused on weather data, ocean currents, and wildlife, but the unusual geological descriptions often appeared only in personal journals or letters. At the time, this probably didn't seem significant. Explorers in extreme environments sometimes misinterpret what they see, but these early reports would eventually become part of a much larger puzzle. In 1895, a group of explorers from a Norwegian whaling expedition accomplished something remarkable. Instead of simply observing Antarctica from ships, they actually stepped onto the continent itself. This moment is widely considered one of the first confirmed landings on the Antarctic mainland. One of the key figures involved was Norwegian explorer Carsten Borchgrevink. Inspired by the experience, Borchgrevink later organized an ambitious expedition known as the Southern Cross Expedition. In 1898, he and his team sailed back to Antarctica with a bold goal. They intended to spend an entire winter on the continent. At the time, this was an incredibly risky plan. No human beings had ever attempted to survive the Antarctic winter before. For months, the sun would disappear completely below the horizon. Temperatures would plunge far below freezing, and the team would be completely isolated from the rest of the world. Despite the danger, the expedition succeeded. Borchgrevink's team collected valuable scientific data about Antarctic weather, wildlife, and geology. But among many records from the expedition are a few observations that historians still find intriguing. Several crew members described moments when powerful Antarctic winds swept across exposed ridges, temporarily revealing sections of rock beneath the ice. In some brief moments, the explorers sometimes noticed patterns in the stone that seemed oddly structured. Some thought they saw long, straight lines cutting through the rock. Others described shapes that reminded them of walls or terraces. A few even mentioned arrangements that looked almost like pathways carved into the stone. None of these descriptions were presented as evidence of anything extraordinary. Most explorers assumed they were simply looking at unusual geological formations. But the pattern was interesting. Once again, multiple observers in different locations described features that appeared strangely regular. And once again, these observations rarely appeared in the official scientific summaries. To understand why Antarctica might hide such mysteries, it helps to remember what Antarctica actually is. Most people picture Antarctica as a solid mass of ice, but that ice sits on top of an enormous landmass. Beneath the frozen surface are mountains, valleys, and ancient geological structures that existed long before the ice sheet formed. Scientists estimate that nearly 98% of Antarctica is covered by ice. In some areas, the ice is more than 2 miles thick. That means the continent beneath it has remained hidden for millions of years. Modern technology has revealed glimpses of what lies below. Using satellite imaging and radar sensors, scientists have discovered vast mountain ranges buried beneath the ice. One of the most remarkable is the Gombertsetz Mountains. This enormous mountain range lies completely hidden beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Its peaks rival those of the European Alps, yet no human has ever seen them directly. The mountains were only discovered through radar imaging in the 20th century. Antarctica also contains hundreds of subglacial lakes. One of the most famous is Lake Vostok. This lake sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice and has been sealed off from the surface for millions of years. Scientists believe it may contain entirely unique forms of microbial life. Discoveries like these remind us just how little we truly know about Antarctica. The continent beneath the ice is a hidden world, preserved in conditions unlike anywhere else on Earth. And every time scientists develop better tools for exploring it, new surprises appear. In 1959, something happened that would permanently change how Antarctica was managed. During the Cold War, several nations had begun establishing research stations across the continent. There was growing concern that Antarctica could become the site of military conflict or territorial disputes. To prevent this, 12 countries came together to sign the Antarctic Treaty. The agreement declared Antarctica a continent dedicated to peaceful scientific research. Military activity was prohibited, nuclear testing was banned, and territorial claims were effectively frozen. Over time, more than 50 countries joined the treaty system. Today, Antarctica is governed by a complex set of international agreements that regulate everything from scientific research to tourism. Visitors can travel to certain coastal regions on guided expeditions, but large portions of the continent remain tightly controlled. Drilling projects require international approval, excavations are carefully monitored, and certain areas are designated as specially protected zones where access is extremely limited. Officially, these rules exist to protect the fragile Antarctic environment. The continent's ecosystems are incredibly sensitive to disturbance. Introducing foreign organisms or damaging natural habitats